Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Grayson stood by the fireplace, not knowing where to put his hands. His wife, Kara, at the opposite end of the room, was laughing lightly at something Vince had said. She placed her palm on his shoulder, barely touching, but it was enough to make Grayson feel something clench in his chest. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Jenna, Kara's friend, glancing at him appraisingly. The gaze was too long and heavy, as if she expected some kind of reaction. The room seemed cramped, despite the spacious interior. People were talking animatedly, laughing, toasting each other. But Grayson was in an invisible bubble of silence. Everything around him was strangely deafening, and his attention focused on small details. The way Kara moved a little closer to Vince, the way her lips formed into a satisfied, almost lazy smile. She didn't look drunk. Kara rarely went overboard with alcohol, but there was something about her demeanor, the way she tilted her head, the way her laughter rang a little louder than usual. It was something Grayson couldn't quite put his finger on. When Vince turned to him, a strange half-smile appeared on his face. He seemed about to say something, but changed his mind. Instead, he scratched the back of his head and took a few steps toward Grayson and muttered, "You know, man, sometimes it's better not to know the truth." Those words stuck in Grayson's head like a splinter. What did he mean by that? What kind of truth should he not know? Grayson clenched the glass in his hand and felt the coldness of the glass surface creep into his fingers. He wanted to ask Vince directly, but he'd already turned to approach Kara again. Their laughter echoed in Grayson's ears. Grayson took a sip of champagne, but the taste was sour. His thoughts were racing, not giving him a moment's peace. He glanced at his watch, then back at Kara. Jenna stepped closer, and her voice sounded unexpectedly loud. "Grayson, why are you so glum? Relax. It's just a party after all." "Yeah, just a party," he said, but there was no lightness in his voice. He noticed Jenna bit her lip, as if considering whether to continue. "Sometimes I think you're too serious," she added, and her words sounded almost like a reproach. "I just don't like big gatherings," he retorted, but he stopped talking. Jenna looked at him again like she was trying to figure something out. She opened her mouth, but then changed her mind. At that moment, Grayson felt everything around him start to move a little faster. Kara and Vince had gone to the far corner, their faces hidden behind the shoulders of the other guests. Jenna stayed close by, and her attention transferred to Grayson. Grayson set his glass on the table and put his hands in his pockets. The same question rang in his head. What truth am I supposed to not know? He wanted to walk up to Kara and ask her directly, but what exactly was he supposed to ask? Vince seemed to be avoiding direct answers as well, and that annoyed him even more. Grayson decided not to show his displeasure just yet. He stood silent, watching Kara move from one group of guests to the next, laughing as easily as ever. Vince turned to him again, and for a second their gazes met. There was a mixture of regret and something else in that look that Grayson couldn't quite put his finger on. He thought Vince was about to approach, but he was called to the other end of the room. Grayson took a deep breath, trying to calm his growing irritation. He knew something was going wrong, and the longer he stayed in the room, the more that feeling came over him like a thick blanket, preventing him from taking a breath or making a move. Grayson stood at the liquor counter, pretending to choose between whiskey and gin, but his mind was on something else. He saw Kara glance in his direction before turning and saying something to Jenna and moving leisurely down the hallway. She didn't look like she was headed for the bathroom. Her movements were too calibrated, too deliberate. She glided through the crowd, deftly avoiding other people's gazes, and disappeared down a darkened passageway. After a few seconds, he set down his glass and followed his wife. Slowly, without fuss, as if he were just looking for a restroom or fresh air. The hallway was dark, with only a narrow strip of light coming from under one of the doors. His heart thudded in his chest. He paused at the door before deciding to peek in. It was ajar, just a little, but enough to see Kara standing in the dim light. She wasn't alone. Ryder, the bastard, was standing in front of her, just a few inches away. His hand rested on her waist, careless but confident. Kara didn't pull away. On the contrary, she leaned forward slightly, her fingers tentatively touching the edge of his jacket. Grayson held his breath. Well, That's it. Ryder spoke softly, but the words reached Grayson as if they'd passed through him. Are you sure? Kara lowered her head, but didn't remove his hand. She took a short breath, as if gathering her thoughts, and then answered just as quietly. Yes, it's too late to change my mind. Grayson felt his temples rumble. Everything inside him felt as if it had collapsed in that second. There was no time for realization. Kara made a forward motion, her lips moving closer to Ryder's. Their breaths mingled. Grayson pushed the door open. The door hit the wall with a thud. It was as if a bubble had burst in the room. Kara recoiled sharply, eyes widening in horror. Ryder froze. Then his face contorted a mixture of surprise, annoyance, and something else. For a moment, no one moved. Shit, Kara breathed out barely audibly. Grayson took a step inside. He looked directly at her, but the words stuck in his throat. Kara jerked away from Ryder so sharply that she nearly bumped into the bedside table. Her face went gray, her eyes rounded. She tried to say something, but her lips only moved soundlessly, like a person who'd swallowed too much water. Ryder froze in place like a deer caught in the headlights. Grayson stared at them both and felt the anger boiling up inside him like magma beneath the thin crust of a volcano. He took a step forward, another. His breathing was quiet, but the tension in his shoulders showed that he was barely holding back. What the hell? He said, his voice calm, but that calm was deceptive. It was the kind of calm that precedes a storm. Kara paled even more, as if he'd hit her with the words. Ryder tried to squeeze out a smile, but didn't manage it. Grayson glared at him, and it was colder than the winter wind. I'm waiting for an explanation, Grayson said. Ryder opened his mouth, but didn't find the words right away. He rubbed his neck, looked back at Kara, then looked at Grayson again. His indecision was pissing Grayson off. Look, man, it was just a bet. Grayson frowned. A bet? What bet? Kara stared at the floor, her shoulders slumped. She looked broken, like a person who just realized she couldn't hide anymore. What does that mean? Grayson insisted. Are you going to explain it to me now, or what? Kara didn't answer. She clasped her hands together in front of her, as if she was afraid they would start shaking. Ryder looked at her again, as if trying to get her approval for what he was about to say. But she remained silent. Ryder sighed then and turned away to the window. This was a stupid idea. Jenna and Vince, they said, well, that it would be fun. Like if you could even notice. No one thought it would go this far. Grayson didn't say anything. He stood like a stone statue, but the tension in his jaw, in his hands, in his shoulders gave away the storm that was rising inside. What did you want to prove? He said at last, and there was an icy tone in his voice. That my wife what? Look, Ryder began, but Grayson interrupted him. No, let her speak. Kara, he turned to her, his gaze like a spotlight from which there was no escape. Tell me, what the hell is going on here? Kara lifted her head, and Grayson saw tears in her eyes. But they didn't move him. Her look was guilty, but she couldn't find the words. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered. You didn't mean for this to happen? Grayson stepped closer. What exactly didn't you want? For me to see this? Or that I'd find out you were in on some damn bet? Kara tried to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Ryder took a step back, apparently deciding it was best to leave this room. But Grayson gave him one look that made him freeze. No one's going anywhere until I know the truth. Ryder barely looked up at Grayson and nodded toward the hall, as if he wanted to push the weight of responsibility away from him. His face expressed a mixture of fear and regret, but there was something indifferent, almost indifferent, in his gesture. Kara froze beside him, her breathing ragged and her hands fumbling as if she were trying to figure out what to hold on to, where to put them. Grayson slowly looked around at both of them, clenching his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Ask your friends, Ryder said finally. They were all in on it. Grayson turned silently. He took a step toward the door, his footsteps echoing in his head, drowning out the noise of the party. Kara rushed after him, her voice a hoarse whisper. Grayson, wait, I can explain. Her fingers tried to grab his hand, but he yanked her palm away sharply without looking back. He strode toward the hall, hearing his wife hurrying after him, her heels clacking on the wooden floor, but he paid no attention to her. All his thoughts were reduced to one question. What exactly was she hiding? What diabolical game was being played behind his back? Grayson entered a room flooded with the bright light of chandeliers and lanterns. The laughter, the music, the rustle of dresses all suddenly became distant, as if through a thick layer of glass. He stopped in the center of the room. Kara came abreast of him, but he only raised a hand to silence her. Would someone please explain to me what the hell kind of bet we're talking about? His voice ripped through the space, causing the crowd to stand still for a second. The music continued to play, but it was as if the sound had gotten quieter. Everyone in the room turned toward him. Someone's smiles faded. Someone's eyes widened in surprise. A few people glanced around, as if deciding who would speak first. The silence began to stretch. Finally, someone coughed. It was Vince. He was standing against the wall with a glass of whiskey, as if he still hoped no one would notice him. But now, under Grayson's gaze, he had no choice. Vince took a sip and stepped closer with a heavy sigh. It was a joke, Grayson, he said, but his tone lacked credibility. Well, sort of a stupid, unfortunate joke. No one thought it would go this far. A joke? Grayson's voice sounded low, like the roar of a storm cloud. What joke? What bet? Vince rubbed his face with the palm of his hand, as if he hoped to erase the situation from his mind, but realized he couldn't. He cast a quick glance at Jenna, but she only lowered her eyes. Then he looked directly at Grayson and, a little miffed, mumbled, "Well, some of us bet money that Kara could, as long as you didn't notice." Grayson froze. Inside, everything boiled up. His breathing quickened, and he closed his eyes for a moment, trying not to snap. Vince took a step back, sensing the atmosphere had turned heated. Kara tried to speak, but Grayson held up a hand to silence her. His gaze, cold and hard, slid over everyone in the room. He wanted to punch Vince, Jenna, anyone who was involved, wanted to smash the nose of everyone who'd made a bet. But he held back. Instead, he took another hard look at Kara. She stood with her head down, her face pale. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't get a word out. It became clear to him that all this time he had been more than just a husband. He'd been the object of a joke, a plaything in some stupid prank. Kara had turned out to be part of it. Those he considered friends supported it. Everything that had seemed solid and stable to him had turned out to be a farce. And now, in this room, surrounded by familiar faces, he suddenly felt utterly alone. Grayson took a glass from the nearest table, where someone had left the unfinished champagne. His fingers felt the coolness of the glass, and that small physical contact allowed him to focus for a moment. He looked at everyone in the room, at Kara, standing nearby, whose face had gone pale with fear, at Vince, trying to remain inconspicuous, at Jenna, who was barely breathing, as if waiting for an explosion. Grayson realized in that moment that the only thing he had left was not anger, but clarity. He grinned slightly, sighing like a man who had finally had clarity. He raised his glass a little higher, catching the attention of everyone around him. The room fell silent. The music seemed like a distant background, and all eyes were fixed on him. He coughed and with a slight irony in his voice said, "Okay, since we're all such betting enthusiasts here, let's play by my rules now." For a moment, no one realized what he meant. Kara frowned, her eyebrows quivering. She took a step toward him, but he gestured for her to stop. Her hands trembled, like someone holding something fragile and afraid to drop it. Grayson took a small sip, slowly shifting his gaze to everyone in the room. He was deliberately stalling, as if he was searching for someone with his eyes. It was creating tension. People stood in silence. Some looked over at each other, but no one dared to speak. He felt like this moment belonged only to him. "Let's raise our glasses to the bet that everyone lost, except me." Kara opened her mouth to say something, but instead of words, a short, hoarse sound came out. Her hands clenched into fists and her eyes darted from him to those around her, as if she were searching for a saving glance. But no one moved, no one intervened. "Grayson, you don't understand. She began, her voice as weak as the rustling of leaves. He turned to her, looked her straight in the eye, and she was silent at once. He spoke softly, but there was an icy calm in his tone. "I understand. You've chosen your game. Now I'll make my move." There was a tense silence in the room. Grayson felt that silence with his skin, as if it had become physical. He took another sip from his glass, glanced around at the people around him, as if he were saying goodbye to them. He had no desire to make a scene, to yell or curse. He knew his departure from this room would be louder than any words. He set the empty glass on the nearest table. The reflected light of the chandelier on its surface blinded him for a moment, but he no longer paid attention to such trivialities. Kara tried to say something again, but her voice shook, her words jumbled. Grayson looked at her once more. Now there was only disappointment in his eyes. She tried to touch his hand, but he pulled back, not giving her a chance. Kara froze, her fingers hanging in the air. This was the end of her attempts to fix anything. He turned and headed for the door. The guests were silent. No one moved. His footsteps sounded louder than the music that was still playing in the distance. When he opened the door and stepped out, the sound of the door clicking sounded like a gunshot, breaking the silence. People were left standing as if paralyzed. Kara bit her lip, her shoulders slumped. She knew he wasn't coming back. Grayson took one last step toward the exit, but before he could open the door, he stopped. There was a deafening silence in the room, heavy, thick, soaked with other people's stares and tense anticipation. Kara stood in the center of the room like a tossed overboard boat, trying in vain to cling to something. She looked around, her breathing ragged, her hands trembling weakly. There was fear in her eyes, not of him, but of the emptiness that now surrounded her. Grayson turned slowly, sliding his gaze over all these people who 5 minutes ago had been laughing, having fun, and now frozen, as if waiting to see how this scene would end. Some of the guests were trying to pretend they had nothing to do with what was going on, but there was tension in their postures and an awkward attempt to hide the awkwardness in their eyes. His gaze stopped on Vince. He was leaning carelessly against the bar, but his lips were tightly pressed together. His face showed either regret or annoyance that their game had taken too loud a turn. Jenna stood a little farther away, her hand clutching her glass tightly, but she didn't take a sip. Her gaze darted between Kara and Grayson, like she was trying to decide if she should say something. Kara tried again to squeeze out something, but her voice treacherously shook. Grayson, he bowed his head slightly, as if wondering what she would say. I didn't mean for this to happen. Her voice was weak, filled with a desperation that could no longer change reality. He hummed, then looked at Ryder, who was trying to keep a neutral expression on his face, but his shoulders tensed. Grayson knew this type of man, the kind who easily meddled in other people's lives, but never wanted to deal with the consequences. He grinned, took another step toward the exit, and, without changing his tone, dropped it. Yes. Next time you bid on another man's wife, make sure she at least wants to stay with you afterward. His words, spoken softly, seemed to explode the air in the room. Kara went pale. She jerked forward as if she was about to say something, but stopped. Her lips opened, but no sound came off them. She looked around. Her friends were looking away, pretending not to hear, or staring at the floor, trying to avoid contact. She was thrown into a chill. She suddenly realized how much the atmosphere had changed. She was no longer part of this company, no longer the woman who was played along, flattered, supported. She was alone among people who no longer saw her as valuable. Ryder looked away. Jenna pretended it didn't concern her. Vince took a sip of whiskey and turned back to the bartender. No one stepped forward. No one offered Kara a hand to get her out of it. Grayson turned and walked out without turning around. Fresh air hit his face sharply as he crossed the threshold. It was cooler outside, but it was still boiling inside. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, running through everything that had happened in his head. This game wasn't just a betrayal of Kara. It was a mockery. They thought he'd be just another guy who got played, that he'd leave this party defeated. But he already knew what to do next. His revenge was just beginning. Exactly 1 week after that ill-fated party, Grayson stood at the panoramic window of his new rented loft, watching the dusk fade behind the glass. The room behind him was the perfect setting for what was about to happen. The even light of the pendant lamps, the perfectly set long table, the bottles of wine arranged with careless precision. It looked as if he'd really brought them together for the sake of reconciliation, for the sake of trying to put the past behind them. But this wasn't just a meeting. It was the finale of a game he hadn't started, but one he was going to end by his own rules. When the doorbell rang, Grayson closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself one last breath of calm before turning and revealing his guests. Vince and Jenna were the first to enter. They glanced over when they saw the table set, but there was something strange in the air, something elusive that made them wary. A few more people came in after them, people he used to call friends, but who didn't hesitate to make him part of their dirty game. Kara was the last to arrive. She walked in slowly, wearing an elegant beige dress with perfect waves of brown hair, as if hoping to impress, as if she believed there was still a chance to turn things in her favor. She froze at the threshold, looking around as if trying to figure out why she was here. Then her gaze met Grayson's. He didn't smile, didn't call her to sit next to him, just nodded toward the chair. "Sit down." Her fingers trembled, but she obeyed. Around the table, the others sat down as well. Vince looked at him expectantly. "Okay, Grayson, what is this meeting? We thought you were, well, chilled out." He grinned. "Cold?" He shook his head. "No, Vince. I just gave you time to think you still had control." Jenna frowned. "What do you mean?" Grayson didn't answer right away. He reached for the nearest bottle of wine, opened it and poured himself a glass, but didn't offer it to the others. He took a sip, then pulled the folded papers from his inside jacket pocket and unfolded them, placing them neatly in front of Kara. She frowned, her gaze running over the headline. Her lips quirked open. "What are these?" "Divorce papers," he answered without taking his eyes off her. She recoiled as if she'd been struck. The others at the table froze. Some stopped breathing, some looked away. Vince rubbed his chin nervously, and Jenna grabbed her glass, as if it would save her from embarrassment. Kara struggled to catch her breath. "Grayson, we have to talk." "No, we have to sign." She blinked, as if she didn't understand, couldn't believe this was happening. "You can't just—" He put his palm down on the papers and leaned closer, his voice smooth but steeled. "I thought cheating was the worst thing you could do." His eyes flicked to Vince, then to Jenna, then back to her. "But no, the worst thing is turning a marriage into a betting show. Now go ahead and sign it." Kara swallowed. Horror splashed in her eyes. "You're doing this for revenge?" He looked at her almost sympathetically. "No, for release." She shifted her gaze to the others, but no one was rushing to her aid. No one was her ally anymore. Her world, her position, her confidence, it was crumbling right before her eyes. And Grayson knew she no longer had a choice. Kara sank to her knees on the luxurious Persian rug. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't try to hold them back. Her shoulders shook, and her voice was so cracked and weak it could hardly reach Grayson. She wasn't looking at anyone else present, her eyes fixed only on his face. "Please," she breathed out. "Please don't go away. I'll fix everything. Give me a chance, just one chance." Grayson stood at the door, ready to leave, but instead of hurrying away, he turned. His gaze fell on her, and for a split second there was bitterness reflected in his eyes. But it lasted a moment. Then his features became cold and calm again. "It's too late, Kara," he said evenly, quietly, but the room was so silent that his words echoed to every corner. "You've lost, just like everyone else." Kara covered her face with her hands, her fingers digging into her hair, swaying back and forth as if she could make herself believe this wasn't the end. But it was the end. No one at the table moved. Jenna leaned toward Vince, whispered something, but he only rose abruptly, his face flaming with rage. He took a step toward Grayson, but he didn't even turn his head. "You ruined everything, Grayson," Vince said sharply, his voice low but angry. Grayson stopped. He turned slowly toward him and looked straight into his eyes. The look was harder than any blow. "Did I mess up?" he interjected. "You're the one who messed up. You turned friendship into a gamble. You betrayed trust. If anyone screwed it up, it was you." Jenna gasped quietly, her eyes darting from one man to the other. The rest of the guests began to glance around. Until a couple days ago, they'd been sure that this story would stay between them, that no one would find out. But now, looking at Grayson's face, at Kara sobbing on the floor, at Vince seething with anger, it was clear to them that it was no longer a secret. Grayson looked at Kara one last time. I'm never coming back to this house, Kara. And never again will I live among people who think relationships are just a game. He turned around and strode confidently toward the exit. The door slammed, and his footsteps disappeared behind the walls of the house. Kara fell silent, her hands dropping to her knees. Her face was frozen in an expression of blank, bottomless sadness. Jenna glanced at Vince. Are we going to make it? She whispered. But Vince didn't answer. His jaw clenched, and he looked away. Because the answer was obvious. They weren't going to make it. Now everyone knew. And now everyone who knew about the bet about that night was in the crosshairs of their partner's suspicions. The party broke up. The guests left in silence, not saying a word to each other. Grayson sat behind the wheel as he watched the dark road unfold before him. He felt neither relief nor sadness, only a strange, heavy clarity. He would never be who he was again. His footsteps would never again lead him to a place where he was considered a plaything. He would take a new path, alone. Thorny though it was his choice. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.